communication. All right. So the handicap model assumes that the signals are costly, either to produce or to cheat, at least. Okay. You know, in terms of some production costs. Okay. But a lot of signals that we see in nature are actually not costly to produce. Okay. And in fact, a lot of signals that I actually work with are have very little cost. And so it will be very easy for this, you know, little robin here to sing, you know, at any rate. They're gonna incur at some point. They're gonna incur a cost in terms of, you know, not being able to feed and, you know, maybe potentially increasing the risk of predation, whatever. But the cost seems to be mostly minimal. At least the production cost seems to be mostly minimal because, you know, they're just wasting their breath, and you know, they have their birds. They don't really have you know, they're not necessarily limited by their oxygen supply, right? So how do you ensure honesty in such signals? Because handicap model doesn't seem to apply here, right? Unlike the kind of the long tail of the widow birds, you know, the bird singing is not necessarily a physiologically remarkable feat, right? It is physiologically, I shouldn't say that, because it is kind of a remarkable feat because it takes a lot of, you know, kind of fine motor control over respiration and the vocal tract, etc. But in terms of energetics, at least, it's not necessarily something that's kind of costly. Okay. So how do you ensure honesty in such signals? Well, one way of doing that is policing signals, okay, and challenging the signalers that you think might be cheating, okay. And by the way, I've gone through the entire lecture and the first stuff by not clarifying this, but I should clarify. I use these terms think and just decide and, you know, all these mentalistic terms that apply to animals. And this is, you know, I have to make clear that I don't necessarily imply that they're consciously thinking or consciously, you know, engaged in some sort of, or even unconsciously engaged in some sort of thought process and so on. So these are kind of mentalistic terms that I use as just kind of a shorthand. But they're not necessarily, that I don't necessarily mean to imply that there's actually kind of conscious or unconscious thought process behind that. Right? I'm just basically talking about mostly evolutionary processes here, and not necessarily the kind of individual psychological processes, so to speak. Okay, so I'm talking about the cognitive, social cognitive processes at some level, but I'm talking from the evolutionary perspective, not necessarily you know, trying to decipher it at psychological levels. Okay, so if you were kind of, you know, thinking about why is he thinking that, you know, why is he talking like this? That's why it's easier to talk about animal behavior in kind of these mentalistic terms. Okay, so a good example of policing signals is these badges of dominance that you see in a lot of different species, a lot of bird species in particular. And these badges of dominance are oftentimes, or those badge signals or status signals, are oftentimes very easy to produce. Okay, so here we have, for instance, this bird called Harris sparrows, which lives in North America, and this is their wintering ground, and this is the breeding ground. So they breed in high Arctic, and in their breeding plumage, they all look like this. Okay, they have this black bib, as they call, and there's black face. Okay, and all the males basically have the same black bib and black face, right? But in the wintering ground, when they molt, once they migrate down to the Midwest and northern Texas, they actually have a lot of variation in how much of a bib and how much of a black face they have. Okay, and that badge size, or the badge, you know, kind of the black bib and the face, it ends up being serving as a badge of status. Okay, and the males with the larger bib end up being the dominant males in the flock. And I should say also that when they're in the breeding grounds, they're territorial. The male and the female mate up like a typical tempered songbird, and they, you know, they defend the territory. But in the wintering grounds, they actually flock together, where you might have, you know, 20, 30 birds in a single flock. And within that flock, there's a dominance hierarchy where some males are more dominant over the other males, subordinate males. Okay, and then this bib actually indicates their dominant status. Okay, the most dominant male ends up being having the largest bib and the blackest face. Okay, now the blackness of the feather, basically, which is what makes the bib, this badge, is essentially a non-costless signal, because it basically depends on whether you deposit the melanin into that feather or not. And melanin is a very cheap molecule to produce. Okay, so it's really there's no physiological difference between producing a white feather versus a black feather, right? So why don't everybody, and being a dominant means that you're in the dominant spot in the flock, and in the winter ground you have access to any food that you want, because if you're the most dominant male, you can just supplant anybody from from the feeding station, or from when you find food. They're not gonna they're gonna fly away if you're the dominant, right? If you're subordinate, you have to fly away, and that actually potentially brings a cost, right? So why don't all of the males actually grow this black bib in the winter ground, and why they actually care about this black bib if it's a non-cost signal? Well, so one way to get at that question is to see what happens when you mess up the signaling system. And so what Seward Rover did back in the 70s, this is a classic experiment. He actually captured these hairy sparrows in their winter ground, and he documented the variation of the black bib, right? And these are actually birds that are captured, but they're alive, so they're not they're kind of taking mugshots like this with the that shows the bib, but they're actually alive, right? And what he did was he painted the birds, and these are both male and female, by the way. So both male and female display the same black bib in the winter grounds, or variations of the same black bib. So he got the males or the females, the birds that didn't have a big or a large bib, and he painted them with basically a Sharpie, and gave them a really strong dominant signal, right? So all of a sudden, these guys look like stud. These guys look like they used to look like subordinates because they didn't have the stark black bib, but now they're actually experimentally made into kind of this dominant males or females, right? Dominant flock members, right? So the idea is like, okay, so if they're actually if they can get away with this, then this signal seems, this is a puzzle, because why wouldn't anybody then display the black bib, right? Because melanin is not that costly to produce, right? So everybody should be producing the black bib, and eventually this signaling system breaks down, right? But if they don't get away with it, then what is the mechanism of not getting away with it, right? So what happened was that when he made the bibs black experimentally of subordinate birds, they actually looked dominant all of a sudden, okay? But the birds themselves didn't know that, right? Because they can't assess the black bib, or they can't look in the mirror and say, oh, I'm looking good today, right? So they actually kept behaving as subordinates, right? They actually they were still fearful of the dominance, etc. And as a result, they basically kept their, or actually they didn't even keep their subordinate status. But what happened was in these flocks where they had this subordinate, birds painted black to look like dominant males or dominant birds. What happened was that these birds were treated as cheaters, and they got repeatedly attacked by the more dominant birds, just without provocation whatsoever, and they're still behaving as a subordinate, right? So they're actually trying to fly away, but they kept getting attacked by the dominant, because the dominant seems to think, or acts as if he seems to think that he or she seems to think that they are challenging the dominant status, right? So what happened was they get beat the shit out of them, essentially, right? And in fact, Seward Rover was telling that he had to stop some of the experiments because the birds were getting literally killed, and they had to stay away from the flock. They couldn't integrate anymore, and so on, right? So this is an instance of policing where the other members of the flock are actually actively challenging you on your dominant status, and then if your dominant status, or if your badge and your behavior doesn't match, then you pay a very strong cost in terms of retaliation. Okay. Now he also did a couple other experiments where one experiment he did was he injected testosterone to the birds, and that tends to increase aggressive behaviors and makes the birds behave as dominant, right? But without the manipulation of the badge, even if you have a testosterone and high testosterone experimentally, and if you behave as dominant because you're trying to supplant everybody that you encounter as if you're the top dog, right? You don't actually rise in status because every time the badge actually seems to be required for a rise in status, okay? And if you actually paint the subordinate bird as black and inject with testosterone, then they look dominant and behave as dominant, and they end up rising in status, okay? So in this case, there's kind of a physiological mechanism in underlying behavior as well. And then the question, of course, is that why don't everybody raise testosterone levels and become, dominant? Why don't the subordinates produce more testosterone and start behaving as dominant? But one idea might be, and this is sort of kind of still not necessarily confirmed. And in fact, there's actually evidence against this hypothesis. But one idea is that the testosterone production might actually be costly, and testosterone does seem to have some, immunosuppressive effects that we know. And for instance, and so it might actually be costly for the survival of the bird in order to maintain high levels of testosterone. And if the testosterone actually, if you can produce high levels of testosterone and survive, that might be because you're high quality. So we're kind of getting into more handicap theory in that respect, right? But at the level of the badge, if just the signal, you actually have this policing that the stronger birds will actually challenge the weaker birds and not necessarily just rely on the badge, okay? But most of the time they won't. If the badge actually fits the behavior of the bird, then they're actually not going to bother, right? They can, everybody knows their place, and these honest signals save time and energy because there's no fights usually, right? The dominant subordinate male will fly away. The dominant will actually get the food or things like that, right? By the way, he also did the reciprocal experiment where he took the dominant males and bleached them. So they basically took away the black feathers and made them white. And then what happened was the dominant males, which of course have high testosterone levels and they're still behaving as if dominant, but nobody cares now, right? Because they look subordinate, right? And so these guys became paranoid, if you, in a sense, where they kept challenging everybody to a fight, like, come on, fight me, I'm the dominant male. Why don't you see, recognize my status, things like that, right? So it was kind of and they end up fighting a lot, and as a result, they actually getting into a very low quality, their condition dropped as a result, okay? And which kind of also tells you that they actually everybody actually benefits from the presence of the signal because it kind of prevents unnecessary fights and unnecessary kind of energy spent in these fights, right? All right, so this is a kind of classic example of how policing can work in a signal of dominance that is not costly to produce, okay? Another instance of that is kind of closer to my research, so I'm kind of plugging my research here a little bit in terms of birdsong. So a lot of birds in their territorial interactions use signals that are that indicate their likelihood of escalation, and that likelihood of escalation really depends on, well, it probably depends on kind of the size and the kind of fighting ability of the bird, but it also depends very strongly on their motivation, okay? Particularly, for instance, where the intrusion happens, right? If it happens right in the middle of the territory, then most birds actually will fight back, okay? Regardless of their kind of fighting ability, they're going to fight back oftentimes, okay? So the signals of aggressive intent are much more motivational, and they really the information they are supposed to provide to the receivers is about the likelihood of future escalation if you don't back down. Okay, that's why they're called signals of aggressive intent. I have a couple of videos here that I will try to show if I can. Hopefully my PowerPoint has been crashing, I think in part to these videos because of these videos. So I'll try to show them to you. Hopefully it will work. So this is for instance, playback experiment, the video from a playback experiment that we did. And this is kind of a good way of introducing the methodology that I use oftentimes as well. We record a bunch of birds in the field, and then we process their vocalization songs, and we clean them up and through various ways of filtering, and then we play them back from a speaker. Okay, and sometimes we also have a kind of a model of a bird that's related to the speaker, and then we kind of look at the response of the bird and see what happens. Okay, so here we have a speaker hang from a branch, and we taped on the branch a taxidermic mount, basically a dead bird, and that looks like it's singing. And we're playing back bird song from the speaker, and here's the actual bird that's defending that territory. So he's gonna sing and do some visual display called wing waves, and I'm gonna narrate that.
Playback, flight.
So this is that was the playback song, okay, from the speaker, and he's right behind the mount here. So he's gonna come over here and sing a wing wave.
Flight, wing wave and flight song.
He just sang, and if you notice, he sang at a very low amplitude, which is what we call a
playback, flight. Wow, huge.
So this is a wing wave and a soft song. So this is kind of a multimodal signal where which they give to threaten the intruder, in this case the dead bird, along with the speaker. Now, of course, they're sparrows, so they're not super smart. So they kind of sometimes figure out something's off and start high chipping or alarm calling, but most of the time, they just treat this dead bird, this stationary bird, as a opponent, another male that's singing and challenging him to for the ownership of the territory, right? And we know that because after these signals, if you keep going, this is what happens. So here we have the dead bird again. Here's singing soft song. Kind of look at it. What's up with you, buddy?
Oh!
Oh, he hit it!
And then that's what happens. Okay, so when you actually really don't back down, which obviously the dead bird doesn't, then there's an actual fight. Okay, and this suggests that these interactions are actually kind of meaningful, in that they do lead to kind of potential fitness relevant behaviors, right? And so now you can do this experiment where you have the dead bird on a mount and the speaker, and then you can ask whether the animal signal or don't signal, right? So you have this outcome where the subject signals or the subject doesn't signal, and this can be, of course, kind of quantitative variation, right? So it's not necessarily categorical variation, but let's treat it as categorical, right? If the subject signals, and if the signal that they use actually provides reliable information as to the future intention to escalate, then the subject should follow up that signal by attacking the mount, right, the dead bird. And if that's a reliable signal, right? If the subject does not signal, that means that he doesn't intend to attack, and then you expect no attack, right? Any deviation from this pattern, signaling and attacking and not signaling and not attacking, is kind of a deviation from reliability, right? And there's going to be some deviation, of course, right? Sometimes the subject will not signal and attack, and sometimes the subjects will signal and not attack, right? And so signaling and not attacking would be kind of over signaling or bluffing, right? And not signaling and attacking will be under signaling, which is kind of a very interesting kind of proposition as well, why that happens. Okay, but all of these cases happen with some degree. And if the signal is reliable, on average, if the subject signals, they should be more likely to attack than if they don't signal, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but it should be on average statistically significant. Okay? And when you do this experiment, you actually do find, for instance, the soft song rate. In the first video, you saw the bird kind of singing very quietly with the beak closed as the bird was doing kind of wing flapping, right? Or those soft songs actually turned out to be predictive of attacking. So for instance, if you compare the rates of soft songs in attackers and non-attackers, attackers end up actually giving a lot of soft songs compared to non-attackers. the birds that end up not attacking. Okay, here's another picture of a bird attacking a taxidermic mouse here. Okay, so soft song in this particular instance is a reliable predictor of an impending attack in the future, right? The same is true for instance wing waves in this case, right? And soft song is a very non-costly signal. It's actually even less costly than a regular song, because a regular song is loud. It actually gets up to 80, 90 decibels sometimes. So it's actually very loud, very conspicuous. But potentially increases the risk. But the soft song is actually very quiet. It's about 50 decibels or so, maybe 50 to 60 decibels. Right, and it's much less detectable by other predators, so it doesn't really increase the risk of predation that much. It might increase it a little bit, but not that much. It's less than the loud song for sure, but it's still a reliable signal, right? So what maintains the reliability of that signaling? Well, you can actually do experiments like where you basically kind of logically the same experiment as the Seaward experiment, the badge experiment that I discussed earlier, where you actually have a experimental stimulus, and you make that experimental stimulus give the signal or not give the signal of the aggressive attack, and see what happens, right? And if this non-costly signal is actually maintained by a retaliation cost, by a cost of policing essentially, right? Then the birds that actually give the signal are more likely to get attacked, or more likely to get behaved aggressively to than birds than the experimental stimulus that you don't have the signal, right? So here's an experiment that a colleague of mine, Randy Anderson, did, and I'll show you another video here. If I can. And hold on. It's not opening. Is it opening? There we go. So let me show you the sound video clip. There we go. There we go. So this is what they did was they were using not song sparrows, but a related species called swamp sparrows, which was the same wing waving signal. And what they did was they built a robotic sparrow of a dead bird, and they made the robotic sparrow wave the wings or kind of just turn around and sort of do kind of a non-signaling movement, right? And what happened was right. So this robot bird was getting attacked.
In the bird world, a wave of the wing is not quite the same as us giving a friendly hand wave. In fact, it's a lot like another gesture we use when we are angry.
I would say that it could kind of be like flipping the bird. It could kind of be like putting your dukes up, saying I'm ready for a fight.
Duke biologist Randy Anderson wanted to study how male swamp sparrows use wing waves to defend their turf from other males. To do this, she and her colleagues built a robotic bird from a taxidermied sparrow and a miniature computer. The scientists stuffed the computer inside the sparrow's body and programmed it to flip its wings, just like a live bird. When Anderson tested the birds in the field, she found they were much more aggressive to the wing-flipping robot than a twisting or stationary sparrow.
So you can see that they will often use one wing or the other, and it's a very obvious visual signal they give before and during attacks. These attacks, when they happen, are usually sustained and pretty vicious, but a point to take away from this video and ones like it is that although physical attacks are very rare between live birds, when they happen, they're potentially devastating. I mean, they can lead to serious injuries and death. And so birds are using these signals as ways to try to resolve conflicts before it comes to a fight.
Right. So
produced by Duke University.
So that's a kind of what happens when you have a robo sparrow, and that's wing waving, that's giving this signal while challenging the territory owner. And if you give this signal, the wing wave signal, then the subjects are actually closer to the mount compared to a stationary or a kind of a rotating bird. Okay, the rotating bird is a control condition where you control for the presence of any movement, right? And being closer to by the way, being closer to the mount is an indication that they're behaving aggressively, right? Because being closer means it's a cue for the other bird that you're about to attack, right? And they actually also give, as in the video, when you saw the robot was kind of wing waving, and the subject behind him was also wing waving, very kind of at the same rate, essentially. So they actually also give this aggressive signal at a higher rate as well, right? So this honesty of these kind of non-casted signals seems to be maintained also by this retaliation cost, okay? And that's something that also can ensure honesty, okay? Right, and just as a point, I kind of made the point earlier that you can quantify this information content by basically, through information theory, right? And by looking at the mutual information. And this is actually exactly what these authors, this Leanne Graves and her colleagues, did in the study with the signals of aggressive intent in birds, and they actually quantified the probability of attack once you observe the signal, and quality of non-attack, quality of attack when you don't observe the signal, and then you can calculate the mutual information based on that, right? So, for instance, in the black-capped chickadees, one study found that the specific call called the gargle calls were perfectly predictive of attack. So every bird that gave the signal ended up attacking, right? And it was also perfectly predictive of non-attack. So every bird that didn't give the signal didn't attack, right? No bird that didn't give the signal attack, right? And you can calculate from that the mutual how many bits of information there is, and this is bits literally in the computer science kind of meaning. How many bits of information there can be in the signal, right? And that particular signal was the most predictive. It contained the most amount of information. In other species, like for instance, in the wing quiver or wing wave on the soft song in the swan sparrow, for instance, it's significantly less, because even if you give the signal, you're not all the birds that give the signal end up attacking. But birds that don't give the signal are attacking at a very much lower rate. And you can still calculate the mutual information, and ends up being still significantly better than nothing, but it's not as high. Okay. And later on, I'm gonna talk about the song-back match a little bit more as well. Okay. So the general point in the slide is that you can actually quantify the information content of the signals in the field, right, from a field data by doing experiments like I showed you. Okay, any questions so far, or comments? Yeah, so are they also attacking when there's no sound but there's wing wave? That's a good question. I think in this particular experiment, they kind of kept the playback going. So in order to attract these males, the subjects, to the kind of your robotic sparrow, you have to start with playing songs, right? And I forget if they actually stopped playing songs once the males actually saw the speaker. I believe they may have just switched to soft songs, but I'm not sure. I should go back to change, right? But I think what I would expect is if there's no sound, but they're still wing waving, they would still be, behaving aggressively to the robotic sparrow. But initially, at the start of the experiment, you should place we are playing usually song to just attract the male into the area where the taxidermic mount is. Right, cool. All right, and so here's a larger kind of table that I kind of copied from Bradbury and Warenkamp's textbook on animal communication, which is kind of like the gospel of animal communication, if you will. and this gives you kind of a larger context of various mechanisms that can ensure honesty in signals. Okay, we've talked about handicap and index signals, and we've talked about the kind of retaliation costs. We haven't really talked about all of the other things, like for instance proximity signals and or modifiers or signals of need that much. But there's kind of the subset of the kind of mechanisms that we talked about is kind of the main ones that that people usually usually think in terms of what maintains honesty in communication systems. Okay. So that's the end of the first part for me. And let me, you guys need a break, another break, or should we just keep going?
I think we should just keep going.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, let me. Pardon. All right, so. Okay, so I'm gonna, in this part, I'm gonna kind of talk more about vocal sequences, more specifically, and kind of give examples of what kind of information can be encoded in vocal sequences, and without getting too technical. And I also going to kind of point you into general direction for kind of software and stuff that you can use for bioacoustics in a minute. So what we do at least when we're studying bird, but this kind of generally applies to any kind of animal communication in bioacoustics, is when what we do is we try to individually identify animals either by capturing them and marking them individually with color bands, for instance. And you might have experience with this, from biology classes, or maybe if you volunteering in banding station, etc. And then once you individually identify them, either by capturing them or by location in some cases, or by their vocalizations, or you can try to identify them by the vocalizations, I should say. But in order to do that, you have to record them, of course. So here we have my master student, Çağlar, is actually holding a microphone and interviewing, if you will, a bird and recording him. And then once we, get these recordings from the field with this equipment, and by the way, these equipments are, usually a little bit more expensive than the kind of regular voice recorders or the recorders that you have on your cell phone. But in fact, with the technological advances, a lot of these kind of equipment is getting quite cheap these days. So it's really easy to get started on bioacoustics these days. And if you have any questions about equipment, I can take them later. But yeah, so one thing that you can do with your cell phone is just to download an app that records birdsong, for instance, and then identifies them. Okay, and once you have those recordings, you can you download them onto your computer, and then you can use various different softwares to analyze them. Okay, and there's actually a lot of software that I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main one. So the main ones that I use are Audacity is a free software, and that's kind of very useful in just visualizing and kind of cutting or creating sound files like noise files or pure tones, etc. Right? So it's actually very good for editing, doing basic editing. It's not very useful for doing a lot of measurements, but it's a free software, and so it's something that you should download and or if you're interested in bioacoustics, it's play around with. The main one that we use for bioacoustic is Bioacoustics is Raven Pro, which is made by the Cornell Lab for Ornithology, and it's the nice thing about that is for us in Turkey at least, it's free. Turkey is in the list of the countries where they actually grant the license for academics, educators, and nonprofit researchers for free. Unfortunately, Greece is not on that list, but it's actually not that expensive. It's I think the student license is about $100, which is actually not that expensive for bioacoustic software, and I think you can still get it for free under some circumstances. So you should if you are thinking about getting Raven for your educational setting for university, you should probably email them and so on. I'm not sure what the conditions are for that. For Turkey, it's for Turkish students here. You can download, you can email them with a copy of your kind of student ID, and then you can download it for free, or you can download it for free, but you're going to get the license sent to them yourself. But then Raven is not the only free software. There's actually now a lot of R packages that you can use in bioacoustics. Some of them are specifically designed for analyzing animal sounds, like bird songs, and like for instance warbler, which is specifically designed by written by a bird song researcher. And there are others are more general bioacoustics or acoustics packages. So C-Wave, and there's another tuner and monitor. Kind of those packages are available for free, and they require some level of competence with R, of course, but they're actually very useful. I will say Warbler is very useful because it actually also interfaces with these databases like Senocanto, as we'll see in a minute, which are very useful for doing bioacoustics. Yeah. There's other kind of custom-made software like Luciana and Luciania, and that's written by Rob Lackland at Queen Mary in London, and he's been working on that software basically for a very long time, and it's actually a pretty nice software. It's also free. Again, it's designed for kind of bioacoustics questions. Rob is also kind of a birdsong person, and so yeah, it's actually kind of a very, very nice program. I use a lot of time, I use Syrinx, which is a program that was written by a guy named John Burt, who was a member of the lab that I did my PhD in. And we kind of use that in the lab all the time. And he hasn't been maintaining that program for a period of time, for a decade now, I think. And so I think it's not on the internet anymore, but you'll see still Syrinx quite often in the in papers and publications that people use. Okay, Syrinx is it's all of these programs are free except Avisoft and so on. So Syrinx is unfortunately discontinued. If you're interested in getting Syrinx, I can send you the exact. I have the file. It's an Excel file. It's a very small file. But it's kind of clunky. And if you're interested in downloading something, I would recommend either Raven Pro or using R as instead. Okay, I'm kind of used to Syrinx, and I got to get around this relatively easily. But I wouldn't recommend it to a starter necessarily. Then there's more specialized software like Avisoft SAS Pro, which is actually very expensive. I think like 2,000 euros. So if you have some labs, a lot of European labs actually use Avisoft because they have the license for the lab, and if you have it, it's very powerful. If you don't have it, or if 2,000 euros is too steep for you, then I think there's you can probably use most of that with Raven or the R packages and so on. And Sound Analysis Pro is another software that's actually free. There's actually a Wikipedia page about that's pretty extensive. I don't think it's complete, but it's pretty extensive still. It gives you the list of bioacoustic software. Some of the links are outdated, but you can Google the updated links by using the software's name. Okay. So the point is there's actually a lot of different software that you can use nowadays for bioacoustic, and a lot of them are free, which is kind of nice. Okay. And the other resource I'm going to point you at is this website that I use almost daily, just because I kind of like to listen to birds. So this is basically a citizen-sized database called Senocanto, and it's specifically for bird songs. And I think there's actually another website that's for any animal sounds. But this is a kind of database where you can upload your recordings for any birds, and as a result, it's going to be displayed in a database. And actually, I'm going to show you the website here. Senocanto. Here we go. So where's the sharing? There we go. So this is the website, and there's actually, a lot of, it's worldwide. Of course, the coverage is uneven because most of the recordings are probably from, the Northern Hemisphere, and, from Europe and US, where most of the people who are interested in birdsong tend to reside, and most people who have, access to recording equipment and so on. But yeah, so there's actually, recordings from all over the world. Okay, and so you can, search for, let's say, European robin, and in this website, and then click on that, and what it does is it gives you the whole distribution range. These are maps from that are derived from the BirdLife database, and it takes a minute for my computer to kind of load the map here. Yeah, so this is the range of the species. And there's a list of the recordings that are out down there, right? And each recording is tied to a location, and there's this type or short description, and then some remarks on what kind of equipment they used and so on. And now you can even look at the sonograms for each recording, or you can download the recordings as an MP3 file, and that's actually very nice if you're actually kind of using the citizen science database for answering bioacoustic questions. So for instance, song variation in respect to latitude, or regional dialects and things like that. So you could try to answer that kind of questions with this database. Okay, and I think, are you guys hearing me? My computer may be frozen.
We hear you, Hocam, and the image is moving. So.
Okay, good. Yeah, the Senocanto website is frozen, I think, in that case, or it's just not pulling up the spectrogram. Oh well, anyway, so and this is also just a very nice kind of website to just waste time in it if you're interested in birdsong, or if you're trying to learn, the sounds of the birds there. Okay, the other website I'm going to show you is BirdNet, and this is actually an app, and this is this isn't necessarily kind of doing science, but more of this is a citizen science project where you can actually download an app into your onto your phone, okay, and then it's called BirdNet, and then it's going to use your phone's microphone. And you can record a bird song out in the out and about, and then select the song, and then try to ask the app to identify it. And there's a machine learning algorithm behind the app, and this is someone's PhD project, and it actually is very reliable. It actually is very, very useful, and it's if you're into birding, or if you're trying to get into birding, and especially birding by ear, this is something very useful. Okay, so I recommend doing this, and also at the same time, every recording that you make becomes data for this machine learning project, and eventually it's going to be kind of a you can actually identify all these songs from this kind of ambient recordings, all these not just songs but vocalizations from all these recordings. Okay. It's right now, I think it only works for European and United States bird. This is supported by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The guy who writes the algorithm is, I think, in Germany, but the project is supported by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's just a very good app. Okay, so that's that, and. Turn to my presentation here. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is just talk about vocal sequences and how you can what kind of information that can be used. Oh, so there's a question about Senokanto, right? Is it possible to upload a bird song and get help identifying it, right? So the answer is yes. Oftentimes there's a section on the website where you can upload the bird and you can classify it as a mystery bird, and then people are gonna jump in and identify it for you, and then they're gonna change the identification for that in the database. Okay, so oftentimes some recordings are going to be, they're going to initially classified as mystery bird, but now it's kind of such and such, right? So that it is in fact possible. Okay, and as I said, you can use bird if it's a local bird in Greece or Europe, anywhere in Europe or US. You can and potentially in Asia as well. I think it probably works with Asian birds as well, for the most part, at least northern temperate birds. Then you can use BirdNet. I recommend using BirdNet as well. And you can actually have recordings, and you can upload the recording onto the BirdNet website here. I don't know if you can see it actually. Sorry, let me share. There we go. Yeah. So if you can actually upload on the BirdNet website, you can actually upload recording and then ask on your browser and ask the BirdNet to identify the recording for you. And as I said, it's actually does a very very good job in identifying it. So that's kind of a remarkable feat of engineering, if you will, right? I actually collaborate with computer scientists here at Koç University to use machine learning to identify not species, but individuals from bunch of recordings of the same species. That's a little trickier because the variation is much more subtle in that case. So we're just starting that project, and I'm not a kind of a computational guy per se, so I don't really know how those machine learning algorithms work, but hopefully at some point we're going to be able to identify individuals of the same species from recordings as well. And I have kind of long-term data sets from a couple different species that we can use for that. And again, Senokanto is actually a very good resource for training your machine learning algorithms as well, if that's something that you're kind of interested in. Okay, there's actually a lot of kind of interface right now with machine learning and animal communication and bioacoustics. And of course, machine learning and kind of human language as well. So speech recognition as well. And there's actually a lot of kind of machine learning algorithms developed by Google and Facebook that kind of recognize human speech that potentially has applicability to kind of natural sounds as well, animal sounds as well. All right, so for the rest of the kind of talk, I'm going to talk about kind of a couple different ways of how you can encode information in vocal sequences. Okay, and here's a table from a paper that resulted from a workshop a few years ago, not several years ago actually. It was I think in 2013. That was held in Nimbios at University of Tennessee, where which is an institute for mathematical biology. And they held this workshop on vocal sequences, and I was part of the workshop kind of as a kind of field researcher, not necessarily a computational guy, but a field researcher, where we kind of talked about how we can analyze vocal sequences and what kind of information we can get from vocal sequences. And as a result, Ari Kershimbaum led a paper in analyzing and understanding vocal sequences and tools to understand vocal sequences. And the paper was published in Biological Reviews, which you can probably Google and find online, or it's on my webpage as well. So these are different ways of encoding information in vocal sequences. So one way of the simplest potential way of encoding information is just by repeating the same syllable multiple times, and the rate of repetition or the extent of repetition kind of encodes information, right? Another way of encoding information is in the diversity of information, whether you're using a single stimulus or single kind of entity, syllable, whatever vocal unit is a single unit multiple times, or whether you are singing multiple units, and how much diversity there is within the, in a given kind of vocal sequence, right? Then you have combinatory, potential combinatory information, right, where you can combine vocal units of different kinds, and that changes the structure of that, or the meaning, if you will, the information conveyed by the signal, right? And this is something that actually some mammals do, where they will concatenate with two vocalizations, and where the first part, for instance, in the banded longus call, the first part actually codes for individual identity, whereas the second part codes for a graded signal of threat or predatory presence, and so on. And that changes the concatenation, changes the meaning of each subset. Okay. And then you have potentially information encoded in ordering, or the syntax of the sequence of the units, and depending on what kind of information it's encoded, it can mean it can encode individual identity, it can encode kind of aggressiveness or quality information, etc. Right? Then there are kind of sequence information that emerges from the interaction of two or more individuals, in terms of, for instance, overlapping, where your kind of two individuals here might overlap or not overlap their signaling to encode information to either a third party or to each other. Okay. And then there's timing aspects in a single vocal sequence, whether how the timing changes might actually change the information conveyed, whether for instance it's synchronized or not, or whether they take turns in terms of signaling to each other. Okay, so we'll see a few examples of this now. So, for instance, the classic example is repetition encoding some information is these chickadee calls. And these chickadee calls are given by this black-capped chickadee here, where the name of the bird comes from the calls. And they are, this is, by the way, a spectrogram, which is how we usually visualize and analyze sound in bioacoustics, which basically is a visual representation of sound. On the x-axis we have time, on the y-axis we have frequency. You can also use an oscillogram or a power spectrum by looking at the amplitude over time, and then you can also amplitude over time or amplitude over frequency range, right? But oftentimes to look at the fine scale structure of the vocalization, we use a spectrogram. And these days you can draw the spectrograms on a computer relatively easily. In the past, it used to be you had to have specialized equipment for that. In the by past I mean 70s, 50s to 70s, and before 50s, people actually used musical notation. There was no way to visualize sounds, and people, when they wrote papers about birdsong, they actually just used musical notations like actual notes on a musical sheet, right? But nowadays we can actually use this frequency versus time plots, which are spectrograms, right? So the chickadee calls basically consist of 4 different call types, A, B, C, D, they're called, and the D is the D part is actually something that ends up repeating itself, right? So it sounds like when you hear it in the field, it sounds like chickadee, dee, 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 dee kind of thing, right? And this is actually very similar to the alarm calls that we have here that is sung by the great tits or other tit species. They're very related to each other. They're kind of in the same group of parrots, and they have very similar calls to these chickadee calls that are kind of, and great tit calls also have these kind of repeating elements at the end. And my colleague Chris Templeton, who was a lab mate of mine at my PhD, actually did this study where he actually presented these captive black-capped chickadees with different kinds of predators. And he had either predators that were captive or predators that were kind of taxidermic mounts, and basically recorded their alarm calls, okay? And what he found was that how many calls, how many D calls at the end of each alarm call there was showed a very strong relationship between with the predator size. Here it's plotted against wingspan, and the logic here is that the smaller the predator, these are very small birds, about 10 grams or so, I think, and they are actually under much more of a threat from smaller predators than from larger predators. The larger predators can't really hunt them in the forest, hunt for these little birds. So the larger predators, like a red-tailed hawk or I don't know, gray hawk, whatever, they're actually they can't. They won't be necessarily hunting for the small birds, but pygmy owl or a Cooper's hawk, for instance, is gonna very readily hunt for these for chickadees and oftentimes kill them, right? So they're actually much more of a higher threat than the larger larger predators, and as a result, they give more decalls, it seems. Okay, and in fact, not only that, when you actually do playback experiments with them, where you actually where you actually play from a speaker sounds or alarm calls that were elicited by a small predator, by a large predator, or a control bird, species like a bobwhite, which is a non-predator, then they actually are much more likely to approach the speaker with mobbing behavior. And this is what they do. So instead of fleeing away when you have an alarm call, they actually approach the source of the alarm call to mob the predator. And so the alarm calls are actually mobbing calls to recruit other individuals in a defensive kind of posture against that predator, right? And when most of these predators are actually detected, then they kind of lose the element of surprise and they can't really hunt effectively. So what these chickadees do is just mob them and drive them away from the area, right? And with the high threat small predator calls, or the calls that have a large number of D calls, about 4 D syllables, they end up mobbing a lot more than compared to large predator calls or control calls, right? They still mob the large predators, but they do that to a lesser extent, right? So it seems like this repetition of the D calls, the D syllables in the chickadee calls rather, seems to encode some information about the threat from the predator. Okay, and the larger the threat is, the more repetition of the D syllable that you get. Okay, is this kind of clear?
Yes, Hocam, I think it's clear.
All right, so the next one is diversity, and this is actually something sometimes this is something that birdsong researchers oftentimes assume, that large kind of diverse repertoire is signaling something about the singer. Okay, in this case, oftentimes the male, right? And in some cases, you do have these relationship, for instance, with age and repertoire size, and especially in open-end learners. And I haven't really talked about the learning process, but in birdsong, in songbirds, the song the complex vocalization that we call song is actually a social learned signal, and it is learned from other conspecifics, and there's a very clear parallel actually with human language learning. There's actually oftentimes a kind of critical period, etc. But in some species, but in other species, there's actually no critical period, and they actually keep learning new songs throughout their life, right? And in particular, those species where there is open-ended learning, as we term it, so they can actually learn in an open-ended fashion as they age. There's actually you tend to get a kind of a positive correlation with how many songs they give in a sequence and their age. Okay, so the repertoire size tends to increase, and this is actually one of the cases where they've quantified that. This is the sedge warbler, a European songbird, and the repertoire size tends to increase with the age of the male that's singing. This is the minimum age that the male might be. Basically the age that since the male was banded, right? So as they go from 1 to 4-year-olds, the repertoire tends to increase from 60 songs to 70 to 80 songs. Okay. So that's one way of encoding information about diversity. So our listener, potentially another male or a female, might be able to listen to the entire vocal sequence and basically just count in their heads how many distinct songs there are, right? And of course, we're assuming the cognitive ability to be able to count that diversity somehow, or estimate that diversity somehow, right? In other species, diversity is much more subtle, and as we'll see, and potentially not necessarily functional. It might be just a kind of epiphenomenon of other things. Right? Then there's effects of ordering, the specific ordering of the elements in a sequence. Okay, and here I have an example from Cass and Sparrows by a paper by Richard Hadley and colleagues. These videos are about this kind of continuous songs where they sing in a sequence of these elements. This is the spectrogram of the Cass and Sparrows song, and these are very very nice little pure elements, very musical notes and so on. And it turns out there's actually a very specific syntax in which or ordering in which these birds sing the songs, right? And in fact, turns out the neighboring males will actually know each other's syntax, and if you actually play to a Cass and Sparrows the song of a neighboring male, a familiar male, that is, they will actually sometimes, and they also, by the way, share these song elements from each other, so they might actually kind of imitate each other's syntax, right? And they will actually sometimes, in these playback experiments, they will actually sometimes sing the next element in sequence. In anticipation of the male singing that, right? So that's kind of a very interesting kind of feat, right? You not only recognize the elements of your neighbor, right? But you also know the ordering of those elements that your neighbor sings in, right? And when you actually play these elements to the males, you can actually, those males are actually are able to anticipate the next element in the song and just kind of preemptively sing it, right? Insert their song in between, which is kind of remarkable, right? This is actually the graph that shows that this SA means song advancing at the first order. So it's basically song advancing, anticipating the next syllable. SA2 is the second next syllable, and so on, right? And the next syllable, anticipating the next syllable, actually happens more often than expected by chance, right? If they were just singing, counter singing, choosing random elements from their own repertoire, then this is the level that you would expect it to happen, but it actually happens more frequently than chance. Okay, so this suggests that the particular syntax at least is encoding this individual identity information, at least, right? Because they can recognize this that it's their neighbor, and you actually don't get I'm showing you the graph here, but in this paper, I think they had another condition where they played a song of an unfamiliar male that you probably don't know the syntax, and that the subject doesn't know the syntax from, and they can actually do the song advancing, as which is not surprising, right? So this suggests at least the ordering syntax at least encodes the individual identity information, if not more than that. Okay. Here's another instance from my own research about potentially kind of ordering effects, which emerges from the interaction of two birds. And the song sparrows that I showed you earlier in the video with the aggressive signals, they also have these song repertoires of loud songs where neighbors will actually share similar songs. Okay, so this is the repertoire of one male. These are different song types, as we call them. This is the repertoire of another male, that's a neighbor. Okay, and if you look at these repertoires, these are spectrograms of the distinct song types. And if you look at these sonograms or spectrograms, what you see is that the first two songs in the first row are actually very similar to each other. And I hope, actually, I'm going to share my sound as well. Okay, I hope that's going to play, or maybe not. Oh, sorry. Do you hear that? So that's the first male song. And that's the second male song. I'm going to play the first one. So they sound very similar to each other, right? And that's because they probably learned it from either the same guy or from each other. One of them learned it from the other guy, right? These are called shared songs, and in fact, there's oftentimes in these in the population that we study, many of the neighbors will share several songs with each other. Okay, and then there's other songs that are going to be unshared between two neighbors, right? And what they do is in contrasting interactions, they use this shared songs in specific orderings. So if one of them sing a shared song, if you are actually trying to interact with that guy, you might actually sing another shared song back to him, and you might even sing the same song type back to him, right? Which would be matching or song type matching the other guy, right? So you have these potential opportunities of ordering your songs in relation to what the other guy sang, what your neighbor sang, and turns out that act of ordering your song or choosing the song type in relation to what the other guy sang actually has a specific meaning. So for instance, if your neighbor sings song type A and you choose to reply with song type A yourself, which means that you're type matching, that suggests that it actually is that indicates that you're trying to engage with them aggressively, okay? Or you're trying to, or at least you're trying to tell them that they should back off, right? And this, from a study that we did, where experimentally we played back songs from the boundary, and then we looked at whether they type match or they didn't type match. And if they type match the song, they were actually much more likely to aggressively behave subsequently, and compared to non-matchers. And again, going back to on the signaling part, if they type match initially but switched off immediately after that type match, they actually were a lot less aggressive. Sorry. Okay, so the switchers were sort of like bluffers, if you will. But the point of, I don't want to give song sparrows a bad name. There weren't that many bluffers, so they were on average pretty honest about the type matching. Okay, so this is kind of a ordering behavior, ordering of your songs in relation to the other guy's song. That kind of means that kind of gives signal in that context, a meaning in that context. Okay. All right. The next kind of thing that you can do with the signals or with the sequences that to change the ordering of in the time of your signal, right? Change the kind of timing of your signal, if you will, right? And this, when you do that in relation to another individual's vocalization, then you can overlap it or you cannot overlap it, right? Many species actually do avoid overlapping in general, because overlapping your vocalization with another sound means that your vocalizations is not going to be transmitting, very well, right? Because it's not going to be, it's going to be kind of at least partially masked by this other vocalization. Right. So oftentimes, especially in a crowded forest where there's a lot of noise, a lot of birds singing, a lot of birds of different species are singing, they will actually wait until the other guy stops singing, right? And they will actually wait for a gap in the acoustic space, if you will, to insert their song, right? But in some cases, or at least there has been a hypothesis that some birds actually may deliberately overlap their opponents or another individual song to just basically jam their songs, right? And this has been assumed to be an aggressive signal for a long time, okay? And this has been assumed to be an aggressive signal, but the evidence for that aggressive signal hasn't really been very kind of forthcoming. People have been kind of beating around the bush around this hypothesis for a very long time, and assuming that this is actually a kind of signal. And this you can kind of intuitively think of that as a signal as kind of interrupting someone's someone's talking, right? And this is actually in humans that is perceived to be a potentially rude or aggressive kind of behavior, right? Just repeatedly interrupting someone, right? It's the same idea applied to birds essentially, right? But in a review review paper in 2009, they said that Sears and Beecher said that it's not aggressive. the people who are actually kind of buying into this idea, chiefly Mark Nagui and then Mel, said it is actually a signal, and then they implied there is no signal and so on. And what I'm just going to show you as the last slide here is that, you know, I've kind of been dealing with this question myself lately, and it turns out to be, you know, overlapping tends to be not a signal at all. And when birds overlap each other, that generally means that they are not actually interacting or engaging with the other guy, right? And when they're actually engaging with the other guy, they're actually non-overlapping. They're actually kind of timing their songs so that they're not overlapping. And that's actually in itself is actually a informational or a behavior that can carry information that you're engaging the other bird, right? So in this experiment, we played back songs from to great tits on their territory and looked at whether they overlapped the song or not. And if the birds actually overlapped the song at a low rate, then they were actually more aggressive than if the birds did not overlapped it at a high rate. Okay. And interestingly enough, that they were actually much more aggressive if they didn't actually sing any song for some reason. Okay. And I think this is actually a good place to finish my presentation. And this actually is going to give you, I guess, a bit of a lunch break as well. Any questions? And, you know, I'm here just to chat as well. Any questions about anything?
Hocam, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that the familiar birds finish their each other's songs, basically, like the male birds.
Right. Or anticipate the next syllable, rather. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened? So I'm wondering how, for example, a female, when she hears a unfamiliar male's mating song, for example, how does she know that it's actually a mating song?
Well, I mean, it is the acoustic structure of the syllables are still, you know, species specific, right? So they can recognize species from the acoustic structure of the song, presumably, right? But they won't necessarily know the individual identity, or they might just say this is a stranger bird, I haven't heard it before, right? Because, you know, my neighbor, you know, John always sings the A, B, C, D, A, right? And this guy is singing, you know, ZYX, blah, 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 right? So they won't necessarily know the identity of that singer, but except that it's a stranger and or non-familiar bird. But they will probably be able to tell the species from the acoustic structure of the syllable, each syllable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Hocam.
And this kind of encoding information in a sequence also happens in a lot of duetting species. I've been kind of talking about male song predominantly, but turns out in a lot of species of songbirds, the females also sing, and most of the species of birds live in tropics, and in songbirds, the tropical songbirds, the female song is very, very prevalent. Okay, and in some species, in fact, the male and the female will sing together in a duet, essentially, and so they will actually have specific duet sequences that they sing either in a coordinated fashion or overlapping fashion, or in an anticipatory fashion. Okay, and they will have, in some species there has been, you know, evidence for like the duet code where you have to follow the same specific syllable with a specific syllable of your own, and these duet codes are kind of they emerge from kind of the common experience of the pair, right? They're kind of like, you know, finishing each other's sentences essentially, and that indicates kind of like pair cohesion or something, right? So that's potentially a signal to other pairs around you or your neighbors or potential intruders, and also a signal to each other as well, probably.
Okay, John, thank you.
Yeah.
If anyone else have a question, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah.
If our applicants doesn't have any question, I have a question. So
yeah.
I was wondering, when we bleach the feathers of birds, do they get depressed? Do they get anxiety, or do they have certain behaviors, or this?
Yeah.
Or do they just, leave their packs and try to find another? Or do they shed their feathers and then just continue their normal life?
Yeah, no, they don't shed their feathers because they molt, they change their feathers in very specific times, and growing a feather itself is very costly. What's not costly is whether to make the color, the feather black or white, right? And so they don't actually give away their feathers, because the feathers actually have a lot of function in keeping them warm, right? And regrowing them takes a while, and at that point they're going to be cold and miserable, etc. Right? So they don't actually drop their feathers altogether. What they do is they become paranoid. It looks like they become paranoid. They become this kind of very aggressive wild card male, or dominant bird, who is always challenging someone to fight, because everybody behaves as if that's a subordinate male, right? Or a subordinate bird, and you feel like a dominant bird, and you feel disrespected, if you will, right? I'm putting it in human terms, but this is kind of the easiest way to make it. So they end up challenging everybody, because this guy lands right next to you, and you're a subordinate bird, and he looks subordinate, and you just keep feeding, right? Whereas if in reality he feels like you have to kind of fly away because he's a dominant, right? So you end up getting into a fight with that guy, and the poor subordinate doesn't have any clue why you're fighting, because you're a subordinate, I'm a subordinate, why are we fighting, right? Well, of course, from the perspective of dominance, he's still the dominant male, even though he's bleached, he looks like a subordinate male. So they become basically, sort of suspicious, or kind of pugilistic birds, who are just like ready to go into fight and take offense at every single slight, and so on, right? That's the description that Sievert kind of used to give us when he described his experiment, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I saw blue carousel males dance and song together for the female document. Oh yeah, so there's actually there's a lot of kind of cooperative displays that depend, and which with success depends on the contribution of everybody, precise contribution of everybody in terms of timing and the skill and so on, right? And in some cases this is also happening in song, although oftentimes it's more of a kind of a dance thing. So we don't really have a lot of good studies on that yet, but yeah, that certainly happens. And Errol was talking about cooperation earlier, I guess. So that kind of coordination of activities does certainly happen. So oftentimes that takes a lot of practice on the part of the participants to be able to time their signals perfectly. So this is not a song thing, but for instance, in wire-tailed manakins, and some species of manakins, there's actually a lot of cooperative displays of the males, and there are vocalizations that go with that, but they're not necessarily learning that vocalizations, so it's not technically bird song. But there's actually they do that practice runs continuously during the breeding season, and then when the female comes in, they shape up and just kind of like do their dance, and hope the female likes it or not. And the success of that dance kind of depends on each participant doing their part. Okay. Interestingly enough, in those cases, only one of the participants gets to mate usually, right? It's the alpha male that gets to mate, and so you kind of have to ask you what's the benefit, what's in it for the other guys that's helping the alpha male. And in mannequins, at least, the answer seems to be practice and social networking. So these very specific dances take a lot of practice to perfect, and even if you're not mating at that point, you still benefit in the long run from having practiced and kind of having been part of this lek and the social network of the lek, so that these are long-lived species. So in 5-10 years of time, you might actually become the alpha male at somewhere either in that lek or in a nearby lek, and then basically you have helpers of your own, essentially. Okay. Does that kind of answer your question? Not sure. All right.
I will quickly interrupt you for a second. As you know, today we don't have a lunch break. Nikos Sonis will